In this video, we're going to talk about how to interact with the controls that we place in our UI. Responding to user interaction is an essential part to every application that presents a UI. In iOS, the view controller provides access to its controls or subviews. The view controller is also the handler for any user interactions, such as taps and gestures. If we need to execute code in response to user input, we typically add logic to the view controller class. To respond to user interactions in the designer-defined controls, the view controller must have an associated class. The default view controller created by the single view template will already have an associated class, but if you add new view controllers to the storyboard design surface, you'll need to assign a class in the designer. We can do this in 2 steps. First, you can select the view controller in the designer using the document outline or the bar at the bottom of the view controller. And second, add a class name in the class field in the identity section. If a CS file already exists with the same name, it will be associated with the view controller. If the file doesn't exist, it will automatically create a new class and add an appropriately named CS file to your project. In C#, it's always good practice to use clear, concise, and descriptive class names. Naming your view controller is no different. It's very common to end the view controller's class name with view controller. When you assign a class name to a view controller using the Xamarin.iOS designer, the class will be declared as a partial class and split across 2 files, a .cs and a designer.cs. All of your behavior will be coded in the .cs file. The designer creates the designer.cs file to store things defined in the storyboard designer. More specifically, this is where the designer will place its specific code to provide access to the controls and events in our screen being controlled by the view controller. You should never modify this file directly. Treat it as a read only. Classes that will be instantiated by iOS need to be registered with the Objective-C runtime. This is done through a register attribute. You'll see this attribute automatically added to classes created by the designer. If you created the .cs file manually, you'll need to add it. The designer also adds a custom constructor to your code. This is used by iOS to construct your object at runtime. This constructor is required and should not be deleted. To access designer-defined views, you'll need to provide them with a name in the designer. To name your controls, simply select them on the storyboard and name them in the identity section of the properties panel. As with class names, it's a good idea to use a standard naming convention. You'll want to make sure to use a valid C# name since this is turned into a property. Xamarin.iOS maps views to C# properties. In the Apple world, there's a different name for this. It's called outlets. An outlet defines a property used to access a designer-defined view. The control must be defined in the screen owned by the view controller class. The property is private to the view controller class and decorated with an outlet attribute to register it with iOS. The other Apple term you will hear when working with storyboard views is action, or sometimes IB action, which is the term used in code. This is when a message is sent from a UI view to a subscriber, typically the view controller. It's mapped by Xamarin.iOS into .NET events. Events and actions can be handled in 3 different ways. First, they can be wired up in code using an outlet. Second, they can be handled declaratively using the Events tab of the property sheet as shown here. Or, for controls with default events like buttons, you can double-click on the view in the designer to create a handler for the default event. Actions are methods that are called by a view in response to a runtime interaction or event. In the designer, you can choose events on the properties pane and associate methods to the actions the selected view raises at runtime. You can also double-click on most controls to add a handler for the default action. When you type in a method name in the events area of the property pane, the designer will create a partial method in the designer file to represent the callback handler. You must implement that method in the primary source file, and it must include the partial keyword to get it to match the defined function in the designer file.